He laughed first. Not a kind, nervous laugh, but the sharp, hot kind. The one that makes 100 heads swivel as if choreographed. The kind that lands on your skin and stays there. "You know how she gets," he said into the microphone at the altar, and the room hummed with complicit laughter, while her hands kept shaking inside white silk gloves that smelled faintly of nacre and hairspray. Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, feel free to share where you're reading from. It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel. Enjoy the story. At the mission of San Isidro, the light fell in long rectangles across the aisle, catching dust and pollen in a slow galaxy. The carved saints along the walls had faces worn into permanent sorrow. It was an old place for sacraments and promises, the kind where a voice could carry and be remembered by the wood. Nora Alvarez stood under that voice, under its history, under the cool detentions of 150 guests, and tried to breathe through lace. Her veil had been hand-stitched by her grandmother, little webbed flowers rising from the comb like a crown pulled from the garden. Her hair smelled like jasmine oil and dryer sheets. On the front pew, her mother clutched a rosary that had belonged to someone who'd crossed an ocean with less than a suitcase. Her father leaned on his cane, knuckles uneven from carpentry and calcium and fence repairs. He laughed first. Adrian Hale, the kind of man who could make a toast sound like a promise, tilted the thin silver microphone in his hand and smiled at the room. The bridesmaids, 8 shades of quietly radiant, turned toward Nora with the automatic reflex of women waiting to catch their friend as she falls. He had already started talking, ad-libbing, ignoring the vows they'd written separately and agreed to rehearse together. He had begun with the story of their first date, the way she'd burned the sauce and called her sister crying, and how he had rescued her from herself by ordering takeout and confiscating her cinnamon stash. People chuckled. Then he reinforced it, the fun, the charm, under a layer of something metallic. The air tasted like pennies in her mouth. Chapter 1, City Rain. He had not always laughed like that. The first time she'd seen him, it had been raining the way the city forgets how to handle, thick ropes of water falling from a purple belly of cloud. Her umbrella had split somewhere between the florist and the subway. She had been soaked to the ribcage, clutching a paper bag of orange tulips, her flats making an embarrassed squeak each time she shifted. Inside the corner bodega, under the buzzing light of single-serve cereal and plastic-wrapped empanadas, Adrian had taken off his coat and draped it over her shoulders without a word. He was handsome the way cautionary tales are handsome, cheekbones you could hang a decision on, eyes too blue to be sincere, a kind of practiced gentility that made the old clerk at the counter call him Hijo. He had tried to buy her tulips when he thought they were ruined. She'd refused. He offered her a cab. She laughed and said she rode the queue like a born believer. "Can I at least walk you to the station?" he had asked, and when the flash of lightning cut the sky open and stroked the bones of the city, she said yes. They met for coffee a week later. He ordered espresso, and she ordered a latte with a mountain of foam she hadn't learned to call a cappuccino until a year into knowing him. He asked about her work, and when she told him she taught music to 4th graders at Roosevelt Elementary, violin and recorder and the gospel of rhythm, he said, "That sounds beautiful," and meant it. He looked at her as if the air around her held scent she couldn't detect. They were careful at the beginning. He was the son of Vivian Hale, Hale and Holt Real Estate, and old money that had always pretended to be new. He was a manager for a venture fund that did not invest in dreams, but in algorithms that made dreams more efficient. She was a carpenter's daughter who ate leftovers in her teacher's break room at 11 in the morning because lunch periods had become negotiation with the universe. It felt like a movie until it didn't. Nora had a stutter as a child. It had made friends out of metronomes and patience, and she'd grown around it like a tree around a fence post, calloused and sure, rings inside her chest where the wood had learned to swallow the wire. She had learned how to sing instead of speak when fear came, learned how breath can travel better than will. Her students followed her eyes when she went quiet. They knew she had words coming, and they learned to wait for music. When Adrian touched her the third time, he held her wrist with the tender caution of a man who knows he could break something and has decided not to. It felt like a choice he had made in her favor. She liked who she became around him, lighter, braver, more glamorous. He knew little places where light pooled around an outdoor table and the risotto was both a metaphor and a meal. He bought her a leather notebook for music. He wrote the date in careful numbers inside the front cover. There were warning signs. There always are, but they disguise themselves as manners, as inside jokes, as the voice adults tell you is experience. In front of his colleagues, he praised her for being sweet enough to work with kids all day. When she challenged him about a joke at his friend's birthday, only someone like Nora could think this dive was romantic. He kissed her forehead in the exact way people pat dogs when they have bitten. She told herself it's how some people love, rough around the edges, trying to be funny, not understanding what lands like a blow. Once, when she met his mother, Vivian's gaze traveled from Nora's smile to her shoes to the small golden Guadalupe around her neck and returned to her eyes with a clinical tilt. "Pretty," Vivian had said, handing her a glass of something older than anyone in the room. "And you teach music? Precious." Adrian was a prodigy. He had perfect pitch at 2. She wanted to respond. Perfect pitch isn't the same as perfect character. She didn't. She smiled and asked for photos of his childhood. It built slowly. The way he chose the restaurant every time because he believed he knew best. The way he laughed when she ordered mac and cheese at fancy places, then introduced her as my little traditional girl to people whose parents own property in countries that had forgotten their names for rain. The way he called her father by his first name, Raphael, with a catch in the throat that meant both respect and something else, a kind of inventory. "Don't be dramatic," he would say, when she told him an offhand comment had hurt her. "You know how you get." He said it enough times that she started trying to count the ways she got to make a chart for herself, a map with a legend to warn the men who say they love her. Chapter 2. San Isidro, the morning of the wedding, the sky along the California coast had thrown a kind of party only the ocean knows how to throw, blowing confetti into the palms, scattering gulls like dropped paper, clouds moving fast as gossip. In the borrowed hacienda where the bridesmaids got ready, there were scents of eucalyptus and coffee and the kind of perfume that never quite finds a name. Lucia, Nora's older sister, pinned the wide comb into her hair, then bent to kiss the top of Nora's head. "Say what must be said," Lucia whispered, "even if your voice shakes, even if his mother's face breaks like a porcelain plate, even if you ruin their day, baby, it's still your day." On the vanity lay a little wooden box her father had made. It was curved and smooth, with a tiny brass hinge and the faint cinnamon smell of his workshop. Inside, on velvet the color of a choir robe, was the ring Adrian had chosen. A platinum band with a low diamond, so it wouldn't snag on violin strings. Tucked into the lid, her father had burnt words with a soldering iron, letters shaky, because his hand had never fully recovered from the fall he took off the scaffolding the year Nora turned 10. "Use your voice, even when it trembles." She slipped the ring into the pocket sewn into her dress. She wouldn't wear it until the altar the way tradition asked, but ran her thumb over the wood until a calm slid down her arms. Priya, her maid of honor, took a picture of the box, then of the lace on the veil. "It's beautiful," Priya said. "Promise me you'll remember, you can also not do this." "You all keep saying that," Nora replied, smiling into her friend's eyes in the mirror. "Sounds like a spell." "It is one," Priya said, and snapped the compact shut. Her phone vibrated against the table. An unknown number, a cluster of words in the preview, a line or two about Adrian. She glanced, heart tumbling in her chest. Lucia saw her face. "What?" Lucia asked, suddenly still. "Nothing," Nora lied, locking the phone and sliding it under a stack of foundation compacts. Some part of her folded the fear into a pocket that felt like déjà vu. She would check later. She would nod at the hairdresser, she told her heart, and open the door and walk into her own life. At the mission, Vivian receipted people like a maestra, telling cousins of cousins where to sit and which side to face. She de-replaced the rose petals with lily of the valley because they were cleaner. She told the string quartet to play softer, as if even the air had to acquiesce. When Nora's father shuffled down the aisle on his cane, the congregation sighed in a collective sound. Pain in a father's ankles makes poets out of strangers. "Walk me," Nora whispered to her father, offering her arm. "I will always walk you," he said, gripping. He took one step without the cane, then another, then another. Each footfall was a persuasion against his own body. They laughed, she and her father, so quietly no one heard. At the front, Father Miguel ashed their foreheads with a soft look. He'd baptized her in a restroom once when the sanctuary was under repair. He had a way with sacraments and broken spaces. Adrian's hair was the precise shade of a summer noon. He looked clean and expensive and smaller than the architecture. He took her hands when she arrived, and the pressure of his fingers said, "We have always been okay." Then he spoke. Chapter 3, a vow rewritten by a knife. He began by smiling in a way that made her think of photographs. "I should tell you," he said, "how I knew she was the one." "Good. Start there," she thought. "Start where you were kind." "On our third date," he continued, his voice like a polished floor, "she insisted on paying with the little cash she keeps rolled like a secret in her wallet." Someone laughed. A few someones. He let the pause bloom. "And when she took me back to her apartment, which was..." "Let's call it charming," he said, and added, turning his head toward the pews of his friends, code for studio with a personality. More chuckles. A ripple through men with expensive ties. Nora felt the old fence post in her chest for a second, rings of humor around wire. "Look," Adrian said, "I knew what I was signing up for. I knew that her family might have needs. ICU bills, roof repairs, that kind of thing. I knew that sometimes she panics." He glanced back at the bridesmaids. "Like when she called me 27 times in one afternoon because I didn't answer. That's love, right?" Light laughter now, polite, most of it. Some of it had teeth. Priya's hand found Lucia's on the pew, squeezed. Vivian smiled with her lips only. He went on. He told the story of their camping trip, where she got lost for an hour and cried into his flannel. He told it as if it were a sweet thing, a lesson. He told about the post-nup, how we're both being adults here, how she had flared up like a little match, and how he loved her even when she throws the pan because the sauce isn't her grandmother's sauce. He told about her father's debt, that word in front of strangers, shaved and neat, left on the floor like a sock. The laughter was thinner now. People checked their faces to make sure they still belonged to themselves. "Anyway," he said, as if he'd done a kindness by entertaining them, "I vow to be patient with your moods, Nora. I vow to support your little salary with my career. I vow to keep you safe from yourself." The saints on the wall seemed to tilt an inch, as if to listen better to her heartbreak. Nora's body knew where to put pain, into wrists, into the tips of fingers, into the small of her back. She felt her stutter rising like a bird trying to leave its cage, all wing and no direction. In the second row, a child with a bow tie slid his foot against the pew and made a squeak. In the back, the door moved with the wind. Father Miguel looked at her, not pity exactly, but something like it, creased with worry and fierce with invitation. Use your voice. She thought of the unknown text on her phone. She thought of the wooden box in her pocket and the message burned into its lid. She thought of Lucia's hands in her hair. She thought of all the mornings she'd arrived in a classroom that smelled like old lunch and cheap disinfectant, and filled it with a song children did not know they wanted. She realized her vows were ash in her mouth now. The words she had written last week. about patience and late-night noodles with too much chili, about how love is a crescendo you learn together. Those vows belonged to a man she only knew in partial light. So she did not speak them. Chapter 4, the silence that knew her name. She set her bouquet down on the cloth-covered table. Her hands in their gloves trembled like leaves. "Nora," Adrian asked, voice low, leaning, "what are you doing?" She took the microphone. It was warm, it knew secrets. She breathed once, twice, mapped the feeling of air moving through her, the way she taught her students to do when fear made their cheeks too pink. "Weddings," she said, and her voice did not break, "are meant for the truth." The sound carried through the mission as if it had always waited to be there. The string quartet lifted their bows unconsciously, as if to accompany her. "I loved you thoroughly," she said to Adrian, not bothering with past perfect tense. "I have loved you through the jokes that weren't jokes, through the way your mother looks at me because she cannot help the way she learned to see, through the post-nup you put on the table with flowers as if that softened what it meant." She swallowed. "I have loved you through my own habits, my panic, my attention." She turned to the crowd. Her mother's mouth was open and covered by fingertips. Lucia was still as a photograph about to move. "I stutter," Nora said. "Some of you know that. I learned to sing when words choked. I learned to breathe. These are the things we learn in order to survive. There is no shame in survival." She looked at Adrian again and for a second remembered the rain, the bodega lights, the coat around her shoulders. "You did not have to make laughter your instrument. Not today." Adrian's face went hard and then soft, a flicker of an animal unsure which direction to run. "There's more," she said quietly. "I wasn't going to because I wanted to keep private things between us, but privacy is not a weapon, and now you have used the microphone like one." She stepped to the altar, set her little wooden ring box on the cloth, opened it, slid the ring out and into her palm. It glittered, obedient and at the mercy of light. "My father made this box," she said, running a thumb along the lid. "He wrote this inside." She tilted it toward the first pew. Lucia and Priya leaned to read, and then Father Miguel. They nodded like witnesses to a sacrament. "Use your voice even when it trembles. And I am going to use mine to say, I will not be marrying you today." The sentence rolled and then sank. Some sounds in rooms are like stones hitting water. You hear the splash, and then you hear the ripple after. This was a ripple. It entered the rooftop, the palm trees outside, the plumage of the saints. The sound of a human decision made in front of God. Vivian gasped. Someone dropped a program. The child with the bow tie stopped shuffling his shoes. Adrian spoke her name again, but it sounded like he had a mouthful of salt. "Sit down," Vivian hissed in her son's ear, rising halfway as if to physically install him back into their plans. He didn't move. Father Miguel cleared his throat, a minor chord. "What Nora means to say," he began. "No," Nora said, calmly, keeping her eyes on Adrian. "I mean to say exactly what I said." There was a sound to paper dresses making small noises as women shifted. There was a sound to expensive leather shoes noting their error in standing in this room today. Nora raised the microphone an inch. "I received a message this morning," she said, "from a woman I've never met." She said, she paused, unfastened the satin pocket at her hip, and pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady now. She unlocked it, scrolled, and found the text. "Read, I don't know you, but I was once in your place. He is charming and smart and dangerous with a microphone. When he gets scared, he humiliates. He says later it was a joke. Please pay attention." The congregation had lost its ability to pretend it was not listening. Nora looked up. She did not look at Vivian or at Colin, the best man, who had started to sweat in little crescents at his temples. "And then," Nora said, because this was the thing that had anchored the day and she had no intention of drowning because she had failed to speak it aloud, "My maid of honor saw something. A message from you to your best friend. Do you want to read it, Adrian?" Colin went gray. Adrian's mouth opened and closed. "This is theater," he said loudly, as if announcing the genre could affect its power. "Then let us all be critics," Nora said, and handed the phone to Father Miguel. He blinked, then read quietly to himself, and as he read, his face changed in the subtle way holy men's faces change when they see what harm is done with small tools. Father Miguel did not read it out loud. He returned the phone to Nora with both hands. "I don't need to read it for them," he said softly into his lapel. "I need to believe you will tell the truth now." Nora faced the guests. He wrote, and her voice trembled this time just enough for the saints to lean forward. "That he wanted to keep me humble today, that it was good to put me in my place in front of everyone, that then I would sign the post up in the morning because I would be eager to fix what I broke." There were people in the room who could not breathe for a second. You could feel their lungs negotiating with events. "I am not going to sign anything," Nora said, "and I am not going to marry a man who confuses love with control." If the story ended there, it would have been enough for a standing ovation in certain circles and a disaster of gossip in others. But before anyone could move, before Vivian could stand and reorganize reality, Nora lifted one hand to the back of the church. "Doors," she said, without raising her voice. It took 2 seconds for the back doors of the mission to swing open on their black hinges. It took one breath length for the room to see what was outside. Children, 20 of them in white shirts and blue bows. 6 with violins, the cheap kind from catalogs with strings replaced by teachers who know what tone costs. 8 with recorders clutched to chests. 2 with a snare and a tambourine. The rest with voices like birds at 5 in the morning, clear because life had not yet taught them how to make mud of truth. They were Nora's students from Roosevelt Elementary. That morning, while hair was pinned and dresses zipped and vows folded, Priya had sent the bus she had arranged, because she knew what might happen, because friendship is sometimes a preemptive act of mercy. The children filed down the aisle like a small procession of future citizens learning how rooms that echo also bruise. Behind them, Mr. Ballas, the school's janitor in his good shirt and tie, carried a folding music stand. The congregation, expensive, clad, leathered, jeweled, was silent. There are few things more holy than the quiet of a room about to hear children make a sound they have rehearsed for. Nora moved to the music stand and lifted it. Her hands remembered the small clank of screws. She adjusted it to her height. She looked at the quartet and nodded. They lifted their bows and stayed ready, deferential to this other music. She turned to the children. "Remember what we do when we're scared," she said. "We breathe together." She inhaled. They inhaled. "What are we playing, Miss Alvarez?" Whispered little Janelle, her violin too big for her shoulders, eyes like coins. "Home," Nora said, because that's what she had named the piece she'd written for them the month she said yes to Adrian. It was a simple melody layered on a pedal tone of C, then rising to something the violinists could catch with fingers learning to curve. The recorders were often shrill. They sounded like tin when blown with fear, but when the children remembered to drop their throats and imagine their spines like reeds, the sound rounded. Nora lifted her hands. The children watched her. Even Adrian watched her. The microphone sat on the altar like a little demon that had lost its script. She counted 1, 2, 3, and they began. At first, the recorders squeaked. It was what they did when adults looked at them, or when their tongues forgot that the syllable do makes better tone than two. But then Janelle's violin found its note, and Rafi's stuck-out knee anchored his snare, and the boy with the eyebrows straight like a painting, Tyrese, who had been sent to the office twice that week for throwing jokes like rocks, sang with a voice that made old people straighten. The melody was simple as bread. It went forward. It lifted. Midway through the second phrase, Nora's hand went to her throat. She sang. Her students had heard her sing daily. Scales, lullabies, camp songs translated through her mother's sighs, call and response that taught them the difference between U.S. history as told by books and as told by their grandmother's gardens. But most of the room had never heard her voice. It was not large. It was clear. It was the kind that makes you rethink what it means to call a thing beautiful. It did not care if you thought. It simply filled the air with adequate truth. She sang the word home and meant none of them. The mission, the hacienda, not even the man standing 3 feet away who had almost been the other half of her roof. She meant a different kind of house. The kind you carry in your sternum. The kind you build with the timber of decisions. Vivian's hand went to her mouth, not to stifle a gasp, because she did not gasp, but to create a barrier between her and the world. She had not planned for music that didn't fit the seating chart. When the last note hung and then fell, nobody moved. Nora let the silence ring. It is important to honor the silence after a song. Children need to know the quiet is part of the music. Then she put down her hands. The room released a breath. I paid for this reception too, Nora said into the microphone now, quiet again. If you would like to stay, please do. It will not be a wedding reception for 2 people anymore. It will be a concert for these children. We will eat cake anyway. Because cake is still cake. A cough of laughter, grateful, somewhere near the back. If you brought gifts, I will return them. If you brought checks, they will be deposited into the Roosevelt Music Program. Priya will pass around a basket. If you brought gossip, please take it outside. It doesn't belong here. She turned to Adrian. He was blinking too much. A boy who had been taught to stand still in choral photos. He went to his knees without asking permission from the man who taught him how to stand. He did it like a reflex. Nora, he said, loud enough for the mic to catch. Please, I am no excuses. I did a terrible thing. I tried to, he glanced at his mother. She had become a statue. I tried to control something that I love. I wanted to remind you. He stopped himself. Something like honesty had arrived like rainwater through a crack in the roof. I will go to therapy, he said, and if someone had been live streaming, there would have been a collective O across the internet, skeptical and hungry. I will? No, Nora said gently. Go anyway, not for me. Find your child self and sit with him in the room where the microphone is his father's voice and the light looks like blame. Figure out why you needed me small. She softened her voice further. Then someday, when you have learned to hear yourself, you will be gentle with somebody else's sound. Adrian nodded, once, twice, like a student asked a question he answered and got wrong and agreed to try again. You can keep the ring, he said. Nora looked down at it in her palm. It looked like decision. This ring is mine, she said. Because it was meant to be a loop at the end of a sentence, I no longer want to write. It will remind me to close other sentences. She looked at Vivian then, and something passed between 2 women who had been trained to be polite in a room where politeness had been used to build fences. You should love him better, Nora said, even if you don't know what better means yet. Vivian inhaled through her nose. She adjusted her cuffs. It was not a concession. It was air. Nora slipped the ring into the wooden box and closed the lid with a click that felt like dignity. Then she turned away from the altar, and the 4th thing that left the guests without words began. Chapter 5. The walk she offered her arm to her father. He stood. He did not take the cane. He took her. They began to walk down the aisle, not as a bride and her escort, not even as 2 people leaving, but as 2 people showing what movement looks like when you decide to move. It was slow. He winced once. She tightened once. The mission breathed around them. The children fanned out, and because they are children, they made noises that broke the silence just enough for them to survive it. A recorder's squeak, the rustle of 2 big shirt cuffs, the thump of a drum against a small hip. Nora and Raphael laughed at the same time at the same thing, the absurdity and the perfection of it. They reached the doors, stepped into the lemon sunlight of late afternoon. The greed of the outdoors for their faces felt like a blessing. People followed not because they were told, but because none of them wanted to stay in the echo of what had been said and not said. On the mission steps, the world went wide. The palm leaves talked to each other. The fog pulled back to the sea like a sheet removed to air out a bed. Somewhere, a gull cursed in gull language. Nora turned. Adrian stood in the archway, hands empty. He looked at her for a long second, the kind long enough to contain 2 months and a guitar solo. He seemed smaller. He seemed exactly his size. She nodded to him once. It meant both goodbye and the possibility of a different hello in a different life. He nodded back, understanding both and claiming neither. Lucia reached her where the mission's shadow ended and the heat began. She put both hands on her sister's cheeks and said, "That's my girl." Priya handed her a bottle of water like the hero hands tools to the one on the stage. Her mother came next, hands shaking, saying in Spanish the litany of mothers, both blessing and fear, both blame and gratitude, all of it hot and wet and necessary. Nora apologized and then laughed when her mother swatted her shoulder with the folded program. "Never apologize for not choosing a bruise," her mother said, and then cried harder, which made them all cry, until even the boys with recorders cried because crying is sometimes additional music. They ate cake. It was a good cake, lemon curd between heavy, clean layers, frosting not too sweet. Children bounced on their knees in chairs that were not designed to receive joy. Priya quietly put a mason jar by the exit with a label that read Roosevelt Music Scholarship in Lucia's sharp letters. Vivian walked past it with her chin high and placed inside an envelope so thick it bent the jar's lip for a second. People noticed. Not because they wanted to praise Vivian, but because a gesture had been made by a woman who had extraordinary practice ignoring others. It was worth marking. Colin, the best man, came near Nora with eyes sticky with apology. He tried to confess the exact way that thin men do when their complicity is a substance they cannot scrub from their palms. "I told him," he began. "It was," Nora put a hand up. "Stop making yourself a plot," she said, not unkindly. "We are not dating. You are not the narrator." He went still, and for the first time since college, was silent in a way that felt like he had finally learned to listen. Children pulled on Nora's skirt, asking if they could play again. She nodded. They did, sloppier and louder, full of sugar and freedom. The music rose into the late afternoon, caught the ears of tourists, caught the ears of locals, caught even the ears of the pigeons with bad manners. People from town wandered in, shy in the way people are shy toward beauty available for free. They gave money because sometimes you prove you are alive by exchanging part of your living for someone else. Adrian disappeared. Someone later said they saw him sitting on the low wall outside the mission by the cactus bed, running his thumb along the edge of his cufflink the way boys run their fingers along scabs, trying to figure out if removing it will relieve or renew the pain. His mother stood an appropriate distance away, the sun putting lines she worked hard to hide back into her face. He looked straight ahead. She looked at the sky. No one moved toward the other. Chapter 6. After the music by evening, the mission's courtyard was sticky with melting candles. The mariachis hired for the originally planned reception had been told to come anyway, and they did, because work is work, but also because they liked the story of a woman who would not feed a machine that ate her in the name of love. They played not as an ending. They played for the sake of playing. They played to show that there are many ways to fill an evening. Nora danced with her father to a bolero, his hand at her back not as firm as it used to be but precise in its knowing. He hummed into her hair. He said lo siento 3 times, and each time she said no, once in English, once in Spanish, once in a language made of the little pulses between their hearts. She saw Priya gather plates and hand them to a girl Nora did not know who was about to carry them too high. Priya shifted the weight, a simple fix, an act of gratitude disguised as a chore. She saw Lucia standing with a man who once broke her heart and didn't recognize her now, not because she had become someone else, but because he had. She saw Mr. Ballas sweeping confetti into a pile with the quick efficiency of a man whose muscles are wise. She saw Vivian speaking to Father Miguel with her hands clasped in front of her. He nodded, grave, then kind, then grave again. He put his hand on her shoulder with the audacity of a spiritual father. She did not shrug it off. It is a strain to finish a day that did not finish as it began. Like muscles asked to do a new thing by surprise, the brain is sore in the way it becomes when forced to say both yes and no in a single hour. Nora hugged people. She received words. She said thank you in 4 accents. She put the wooden box in her bag and forgot, then remembered, then put it somewhere else, then forgot again. When night dropped hard the way it does near the coast, the last children climbed onto the bus, waving with the kind of vigor that means they have invented dreams they will take to bed and lick in the dark. Parents asked if they were in trouble for missing soccer. She said no, and meant it, and knew that the next time they practiced they would blow their recorders hard to show the way breath can be used to make a life. "Come home," her mother said, meaning their home, the small one with walls the color of chamomile and a couch that groaned when you sat too heavy. Nora thought of the apartment she and Adrian had chosen together, now with boxes labeled hers and his, now with a fridge that held ginger beer and high-end mustard, and an open jar of pickles that tasted like the brine in which she had been soaking herself in the last months. She thought of sleeping under the mission's long skin of night. She thought of sleeping under a sky where there were no roofs. "I'm going to Lucia S," she said, "for a night or a month." Her mother nodded, frayed and fierce from loving women who know how to leave. On the drive to Lucia S in a car that smelled like spilled coffee and clean laundry, Nora took out her phone again. She scrolled to the number that had texted her hours earlier. She typed, "Thank you, I listened." The reply came before the light turned green, just a heart. Not the emoji, an ancient heart, typed with 2 parentheses and a lesser than sign. Less than 3. 3rd grade hearts. She laughed. For a second it undid the day in the best way. Lucia's apartment had yellow walls. Unlike their mother's walls, these were deliberately yellow, the designer's union with a bowl of lemons on a table. Lucia poured wine. They sat with their shoes off on a couch that had a tear in the seam nobody bothered to fix because the whole apparatus of their family depended on cutting and reusing, not perfect stitches. "We'll go to your place tomorrow," Lucia said, the planner already sketching to-do lists in the periphery of her mind. "We'll get your things. We'll call a locksmith. We'll change the locks on your heart later. I know a guy." Nora laughed so hard she coughed. She fell sideways into Lucia's lap and cried and laughed simultaneously, which is something only sisters allow. Priya texted a photo, the mission's courtyard at dusk, candles dug into the stucco walls, wax dripping like the day had been a birthday. The caption, "You did that." She fell asleep with her face in a throw pillow that smelled like Lucia's perfume and the cheapest Spanish body lotion from the drugstore. Her dreams were not easy. She woke twice. In the dark, she reached into her bag, found the wooden box, and put it on the nightstand. The lid was smooth, like a prayer that had been prayed thin by repetition. Chapter 7. After months pass the way months do when they are made of choices. Fall came. Her students learned this land is your land and argued about the verses the textbooks leave out. The scholarship jar got heavy. Someone from the mission called the local paper, which wrote a story that folded love and embarrassment into a narrative that made Nora the heroine and Adrian the villain. Nora hated this binary because human beings are not parables, they are people. She took the check from Hale and Holt when it arrived and wrote a thank you note to Vivian with no adjectives, only nouns and verbs. "Thank you for your contribution to the Roosevelt music program. It will fund 15 violins, 1 cello, 1 year's worth of lessons for 5 kids, and the kind of memory that tells them someone as formidable as you gave." A letter came from Adrian in an envelope that had been too much licked. He apologized without metaphors. He told the truth in direct language a therapist would be proud of. He said, "I will always be sorry. I used a microphone to do the work my mouth should have done quietly, and my mind should have done before I spoke at all." He said, "I hope your students play so loud their grandchildren hear." He said, "There is no and in this sentence." She wrote back 2 lines, "Thank you for this." Heal, She did not see him until spring. She was walking from the subway, a tote bag pulling her shoulder down, a violin case banging her knee sometimes because she had borrowed it for a child and was taking it to be repaired. The rain was easy, like a faucet almost closed. She saw him under a scaffolding roof, a different scaffolding in a different city, with a paper cup in his hand he had somewhere to put and no trash can. He saw her. He prepared a face to match what he thought she would need to see. They stood for a second like old friends who were not. He moved first. "Hi," he said, not in the way people say hello in movies, but normal, with the unglamorous voice of a person who learned for a second that life is not about staging, but about presence. "Hi," she said, and shifted the violin case against her shin. "You look well," he said and meant it. "You too," she returned and also meant it. There was a pause long enough to be a hallway. He walked down it. He stopped. What was he? "I'm working on it," he said, and a flash of humor lit his face the way it had when he first draped a coat over her. "Turns out I'm quite a project." "Aren't we all?" she said, and their smiles met in the space between them and nodded. He gestured toward the rain. "You have enough umbrella?" he asked, and then his face broke into a laugh they both could bear. "Old habits." She lifted her tote bag. "I carry my own weather," she said. When she got to school, the hallway smelled like paint and gum. She unlocked the music room. The chairs were set in their careful semicircle. She set the violin case on her desk and took out the wooden box she had carried in her bag since the wedding, superstition, muscle memory, the need to touch wood sometimes to remind herself she is a boat. She opened the lid. Inside was the ring. She turned it in her fingers, watched the way it made its own little weather. Then she took it out, slid it onto the ring finger of her right hand, the way women in some countries mark a vow to themselves. She lifted her hand into the light. It looked like decision again, like a period masquerading as a circle, like closure and opening sharing an address. There is a difference between an ending and a close. An ending is hard as a slammed door. A close is an old door someone sanded and painted and reopened with an easy hinge. She thought of the mission door. She thought of the sound of children breathing together before music. She wrote on the blackboard, "Breathe." Then, "We play home." The children came in like weather. Tyrese had a new haircut that looked like he had decided to be in control of the height of his hair. Janelle's violin had a new nick she lied about. Nora would not ask until after class when lies have softened enough to be gently removed. They took their seats. They traced the air with their bows and recorders. "Today," Nora said, and her voice did not shake, "we're going to learn how to stay in time when someone tries to speed you up." Tyrese raised his hand. "Like a person?" He asked, distrustful of these metaphors. "Exactly," Nora said. "Like a person." They breathed, they played. Nora had humiliated no one at the altar. She had taken humiliation given to her and refused to wear it, the way you do with a coat someone offers you at a party when you are already warm. What she did next left guests speechless, but more importantly, it gave the children the words they needed to name an instrument they would carry inside their ribs for the rest of their lives. Voice. Months later, at the mission of San Isidro, a woman sat in the pew alone, touching the edge of the altar where wax had dripped and hardened on the day a bride chose, telling the truth over telling it later. The woman was Vivian. The saints looked down, still worn, still not shocked by anything. She placed a lily of the valley at the base of one statue and whispered, "Apology only big enough to be one person's, not yet big enough to be public." She walked outside, and the air smelled like the beginning of oranges. On the low wall, a boy with earbuds practiced beatboxing under his breath. He would never know the story of the day, not from her. He would only know the way places keep sounds, and the way sometimes, if you have the courage, you can leave a bad sound inside a good room and it does not claim it forever. Nora went home that night to her own apartment. The boxes were gone now. The fridge had the mustard she liked. She opened the wooden box and pressed her finger inside to feel the slight ditch where her father's letter had burned the wood. "Use your voice, even when it trembles." She did. She would. Her voice would tremble again. That was fine. Trembling is just a heart showing up to its job. She sat on the sill and sang, quietly, for practice, for no one, for herself, for the ghosts of saints in missions who had always wanted to hear a woman tell the truth with a microphone, without letting it make her small. She looked out over the city and thought not of the altar where she had been unmade, but of all the rooms where she would make and be made again. The children would be playing in the morning. The light would be better. It would fall on their shoulders like an instruction. Sit up. Breathe. Speak. Play. This is home. This is how you do it when you are not afraid, or when you are afraid and do it anyway.